Okay, this is Fredrick Kenniston at Axiom, and we're doing the Translation Tips webinar. This is going to be covering different tips and tricks and things to care for and data that Axiom ourselves have gathered over the years, and me, myself, have also researched and gathered in helping people doing translations. And that's the nature of this webinar. Is I'm going to be covering both MicroStation and AutoCAD's tools, and at the end I'm going to cover something a little special oriented that will kind of tie it all together and make things a bit more efficient as well. So first thing I'm going to cover is Axiom for many years has done, we used to do consulting for people that were doing translations from MicroStation AutoCAD and vice versa. And the people that we deal with, we're a third-party software developer in the MicroStation and AutoCAD realm, and have been for MicroStation since 1985, and for AutoCAD since, I think, 2010 or so. And in the process of doing that, the people that we would deal with that needed to do translations would often be more MicroStation-oriented shops, but they would have some AutoCAD expertise, or they'd be more AutoCAD-oriented shops and have some MicroStation expertise, or vice versa sort of thing. And often these entities or these organizations would bid on jobs where they'd have to deliver them in the file format, which wasn't their primary technical expertise. So it would be a MicroStation shop that would bid on jobs that they needed to deliver in AutoCAD format just to help keep the doors open, keep business going through the place. And so they would do the work in MicroStation, most of it anyway, and then periodically during the job they would then translate the files out to AutoCAD, check them, make sure that they followed the specifications that the client who needed the AutoCAD files needed and then would accept. And then it would also happen the opposite too, where AutoCAD, mostly an AutoCAD shop, would bid on jobs that they needed to deliver in MicroStation form, and they would do the work in AutoCAD and then translate periodically those files as they go through the project to the MicroStation side, making sure, checking them with different software, but also manually in some cases to make sure that they met the specifications that the client required. So in the process of doing those, doing that consulting, the product manager that was originally working on that, he used to use the MicroStation command line driven translator because you could use a comma separated value file, which you can get through the interface, which I'll show you here in a little bit, of MicroStation, to then help do mappings from levels to layers, fonts to fonts, and things of that nature. And you have a similar setup in AutoCAD, and then later he also worked with the AutoCAD translator doing the same thing. So that's where a bulk of our knowledge and experience and expertise came from, was the work he did. And then since then, I've also gathered additional data and done some looks around different interfaces for the work that we do with helping people with translation since that time. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go over things about the two programs. And the two better known CAD programs are the ones we're covering here, which is MicroStation AutoCAD. And they're used for the bulk of design, particularly when it comes to architecture and civil engineering around the world. Now, there are other CAD programs out there which handle other things. Architecture, Revit is also getting more prominent, but it's BIM-oriented, obviously, and then there's SolidWorks and other mechanical-oriented ones too. But MicroStation and AutoCAD still collectively together have a huge, huge market share and influence on what's going on in the area of design as far as computer-aided design work. Now, these two programs do things differently, and for those of you that are a little bit familiar with one or both of them, will know this. And one of the biggest problems you run into when translating is that AutoCAD itself has a certain way which designs were built and they have been built that way for a while. And it's kind of a methodology and workflow, the way designs have been put together. And MicroStation also has its own way, and when I go into the workflows and how they've been put together, you'll understand what I'm saying, and many of you will recognize this data too. For example, in AutoCAD, you have a model space, and where everything you do as far as in model space is done at one-to-one. And then you set up paper space layouts to put your sheets together, and you do viewports to link in data from model space and go from there. And in MicroStation, you can do it that way also. And in MicroStation itself, you have through here models, which models in MicroStation V8 are roughly an approximation of things that you could do in the AutoCAD side of things. So in AutoCAD, you have model space where you do your design work, which is 3D, and although you can do 2D work in it too, and then your layouts, paper space layouts are 2D. And in MicroStation, you have what's called a design model, which is just a container to put design elements. And normally a design model is where you'd put your geometry, similar to model space in an AutoCAD file. And then you have two other types of models or containers that you can put together in a MicroStation V8 file. And those are a drawing model, which is kind of a combination of a sheet and a design model, where you can do things to like expand on things that you might not expand on in a sheet. A sheet might be the way that the concept was for MicroStation. A sheet would be a normal sheet, and then a drawing model might be something a little bit more detailed on a particular section or area to make it easier to document some special thing from a sheet that might require a bit more detail related to how to build or construct a certain area. But they could be used in different ways. But in most cases, the models that are used in a MicroStation file are a design model and then sheet models, which the rough equivalent those are of model space and paper space in an AutoCAD file. Now, the other difference related to those is that in MicroStation, you have, when you create a design file, it automatically has a default design model, but you can also create other design models. And basically, it would be like in AutoCAD if you could create more than one model space there. However, the way the translations work between the two files, when you do the translation, only the default design model is the one that will translate into AutoCAD model space. And then the other design models, you'll either have to, in MicroStation, copy those out to their own separate files and then translate them separately, or tell it through the translation settings, which I'll go into in a little bit, that you want them to be processed out to AutoCAD, for example, into paper space layouts. So that's just kind of a little bit of overview as far as the different file formats. Plus, in relationship to working with the different files, here's how, for MicroStation, the workflow, even back before MicroStation existed, would work, is that, this would have been back from the Intergraph days, is you would create a design file that had your geometry in it, and then you would create separate design files as sheet files, which you would then link in the geometry from the other design file in. You'd do it a reference, or an XREF, as you'd call it in AutoCAD. So the difference was, and still that workflow, by the way, is used to this very day, even though you can set up a V8 design file similar to how you could work in an AutoCAD file with model space and paper space. But that workflow of having one file which has your geometry and then separate sheet files is still something that's very common in how you work with designs in MicroStation to this day. So even though you have the ability to work like you can in AutoCAD, it's still not common that it's used that way, just to give you an idea. Now, because of that, that's the two major differences in the working with those programs. Then, in addition to all that, they also do things differently as far as different elements are handled in different ways. And when you try to translate one file to the other, one thing that's going to help you is looking through the documentation in both MicroStation and AutoCAD's help files related to the types of elements and objects that are not fully supported when you're going from one format to another. In other words, before you start working on files that you're going to have to translate, it would behoove you to do something like this, to go into MicroStation's help, for example, help contents, and the same thing for AutoCAD, and do a search under translation, or let me see, DWG actually, search there. And here, for example, this topic, it includes strategies and techniques for working with them. when you're going from one file format to the other. And AutoCAD, in its help, has similar data. And it'll give you information as you search through here on different recommendations, different limitations of things that you may have to care for when you know you're going to be creating files in one format that are eventually going to be translated, because you'll then be able to avoid objects or elements in one file format or the other that you know aren't going to translate out correctly, or that you're just going to have to drop the line work and have it translate out that way and then reconnect the line work into a object that the other format would recognize. So the other part of all this is that every project that you work on requires that you follow certain standards. And the standards that you get from an AutoCAD client are often quite a bit different from the standards that you're required to meet in a MicroStation project, and vice versa. So if you're designing a MicroStation and saving to AutoCAD, for example, and if you're going to be doing that, there's some fundamental things you should be aware of. And the same thing holds true for the other side. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to go to MicroStation here again, where I was. And I happen to have a copy of a file that was originally a design file, which I saved out as an AutoCAD file, and then I reopened it and saved it out as a MicroStation file in order to give some examples of things that you'll find when working with one format or the other in relationship to translation. So the first thing I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to go to File, Open, and notice when I go down here to Files of Type, I've got it set to All Files. So in that case, I can, in my folder that I've got set up for this particular webinar, I've got both MicroStation and AutoCAD files here. And one thing you'll notice is if I select this AutoCAD file, for example, down at the bottom, you'll see here this Options button. It becomes active. So I'm going to go back to my MicroStation file, show you that it's not on right now. And then when I click it again, it is active. So this is going to be for DWG Open Settings, meaning if I'm going to be working with AutoCAD files where I want to open them, and then eventually I'm going to save them as a MicroStation file, this is the first area of translation that we're going to go into, and these options will help you with that. So when I click Options here, notice the first thing you'll see here is Architectural Units. Now, the units here it says is inches, which is fine, but we're going to be using probably in most cases is this area right here where it says decimal, scientific, or fractional units. And the reason for that is just because of how you're going to be dealing with the measurements when you're coming from AutoCAD to MicroStation and vice versa. And one point I need to emphasize here is related to this. Up until AutoCAD and Civil 3D 2017, you didn't have a U.S. survey foot as a unit that you could utilize, or that was fully supported, I should say, in those versions of AutoCAD and Civil 3D or prior. So if you are going to be working with files that were put together for AutoCAD using AutoCAD 2017 or 2016 or Civil 3D or earlier, and you're going to be trying to work with those files in MicroStation, this would obviously be probably some legacy projects or projects that are still kicking around in those file formats, then this is something you're going to have to care for, which is if you just grab through here a DGN seed file and you say, just make the units here inches, for example, or I'm sorry, survey, if you just say feet, for example, or even survey feet, if you just set it that way, then what's going to happen is those files are just going to be mapping feet to MicroStation. And in MicroStation, almost always people that are doing civil work there are going to be using the U.S. survey foot. So you're going to end up with references when they're attached and things like that. Things are going to be off a little bit. And the exact measurement is, it's like 2 parts per million. So for example, if in relationship to a foot, which is international foot that you were taught in, for those of you who are engineers, or even architecture actually. So an international foot is somewhat shorter than a U.S. survey foot. U.S. survey foot, the measurements when you look at them would be this. If you had 1 million international feet compared to 1,000,000 U.S. survey feet, then the million feet, or international feet, would end up being 2 feet shorter than 1,000,000 U.S. survey feet. So you'd have to add 2 more international feet in order to be the same exact distance as 1,000,000 U.S. survey feet. So it's off a little bit. If you had a measurement of 10,000 feet, for example, the difference would be, if you're using international foot versus U.S. survey foot, the difference would be like a little less than 1/4 of an inch for comparing one of those measurements to the other. So it's something you have to care for. And the way you do that is if you are working with a legacy project, in MicroStation in particular, where you do need it to be U.S. survey feet once you've finished working with the files, then the way you do that is not through here by saying use U.S. survey feet. What you would want to do is you would want to use the selection that says seed file master units. Now, in order to make that work, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to grab a seed file for helping you do the translation from MicroStation AutoCAD. And this DWG Open options are oriented to doing translation, but it's from AutoCAD to MicroStation. Then you could use one file called transseed, which is it's a standard file that comes with MicroStation, but the problem is that it's set up for mechanical. So you wouldn't be able to use that just off the shelf to help you do your DWG Open options so that you're in the context of AutoCAD 2016 and earlier files are using just feet, and you need to map those to U.S. survey feet. What you'd have to do is one of two things. You'd either have to make a copy of that seed file and go into its design file settings, and I'll show you that here. So I'll go File, and I've already made a copy of this to do this sort of thing, just so you know. Just make this easier for you. Then you go to Settings, Design File, and then look under Working Units, and notice this is set to U.S. survey feet and U.S. survey inches. So this, I took a copy of transseed, which you can find down in your install folder area for MicroStation. You might have to search for a bit and just go down into Program Files x86 for V8 or Program Files itself for MicroStation Connect, and then search for transseed, and you'll find the seed file. Make a copy of it. This is one way to do this, by the way, and then change those settings to what you want here, and then the other settings as appropriate. And then you could use that as the seed file for those DWG Open options. And then when you do that, let me go back here. You go File, Open, and then I'll go back to my DWG file, Options, set here. Then you'd navigate out and you'd pick up that seed file, open it, and then you would set your settings here to seed file master units. So what that does is it doesn't matter then what's being used in the AutoCAD file, and this actually would work whether the AutoCAD files are 2016 or above or newer, because all it's going to do is it's going to map whatever measurement is used to, or on a one-to-one basis, to U.S. survey feet. And then everything, when their files are translated, in this case opened, will end up being the proper distances for the things you're going to be doing if you're doing civil work related to the files that I'm talking about. Now, the other way is the client that you're working with, often they'll have a seed file already to help you create new files related to the work you're going to do, and they might have other auxiliary files related to the work you're going to do that you would be able to utilize in order to do the same type of thing. So you may have to care for it yourself, but in many cases, the client that you're working with, whether it's like a state DOT or something like that, will have resource files like seed files and things like that that can help you do the type of work in this particular instance and case that I'm talking about here. Now, the other settings that you see here, I touched on architectural engineering units. For the work you're going to be doing in MicroStation, if you're going from AutoCAD to MicroStation, is just leave it at inches, and then this is where you would set the seed file master units to map to U.S. survey feet if you're doing civil work there. You can preserve any MicroStation settings if you want. That's just on by default. Model space. So if the files that you're going to be opening from AutoCAD here in MicroStation are, you want to have them as 2D when you're working with them in MicroStation or flat, then you can say, go ahead and create 2D models for model space. That's on by default. So if you don't want that, in other words, since model space in AutoCAD is 3D 3D itself, and you're not going to be doing 2D work with that data in MicroStation, then you're going to want to make sure you go here and turn this off. Then you also have the option for the design background color. Sometimes people like the white or black, but you can click here and choose any color that you want. White and black are the most common ones, though. And then for paper space, so you can create 2D sheets for paper space, which is the default, and they are 2D in AutoCAD, but you could have 3D sheet models in MicroStation as well. So if you do want 3D sheet models in MicroStation, then when you translate, you would just turn this off. But in most cases, leaving it on is going to get you what you want, because most of the sheets that you would work with will be in 2D. Then you have other options here under Advanced, using this seed file global origin. Now, this is not used as much as it used to be. It used to be a requirement many times when you were working with people that needed files in MicroStation format, where they specified as part of the standards that a global origin needed to be utilized related to the files. There's only, I think, one entity still out there that does this, but the last time I knew this was a little over a year ago. They may have changed since then, and that was Caltrans, or California Department of Transportation. But it's almost never used now. But if you do get a standard that says to utilize it, then all you would do is go into this setting and then turn it on. And what this would do is, related to the seed file that you're working with, again, in most cases you would get that from a client. It would already have the global origin set in the seed file, and then you just tell it, okay, since that's what they specify, make sure that you turn that on to use that. Now, the other settings here, down here at the bottom, you have line weights. So you can map the DWG real-world measurement line weights to the MicroStation kind of arbitrary, but they're not really arbitrary. They're actually pixel-oriented weights. And the way you do that is this. Notice you have 0, 1, 3. So if you have a measurement between 0, 9 and 0, 1, 3, then it's going to round up to whatever this next one is. And the way you would do this is you'd click here, and then you could choose if you needed like 20. So anything now from between 10 and 20 will map to 2. That's how you set this. And if you need the other mappings to go other ways, you can do so by just clicking and selecting the ones you want. After you've got these selected and set the way you want, you would click OK. And now with those settings set, you're going to open your AutoCAD file, and things should lay out the way you expect as far as the size and where things are and that sort of thing. And now with that being the case, notice here it tells you specifically in the upper left corner here that you've got the DWG file open. Now you could go File, Save As, or Export, either way. And now you can save it out as a design file, and you can set further settings to further care for things that you might want with the file being in MicroStation form. So we're going to go over that. So I'll click Options, or first I'll click it to MicroStation, and then I'll click Options. And notice we have Remap here first. Now, Remap is where you would create a comma-separated value file to map levels to layers, fonts to fonts, and things of that nature. And the way you do that is if this is the first time that you're doing this, you would click this last button here, Create a comma-separated value file. And there's a template. In fact, let me go on disk here because I wanted to show you this here. Where is it here? Save template. There we go. Is that it? Nope, line style resource. There we go. So in MicroStation V8, in this particular folder area, so it's down, it's actually different for V8 compared to MicroStation Connect, is it goes down to Program Data, Bentley, MicroStation V8 iSelect Series, Workspace System Data. There's a template down here, right here, remap template.xls. So when you click that button that I was just showing you to create, let me go back here, to create the comma-separated value file, it finds that Excel file and then makes a copy of it and then opens it up in Excel. And you notice I've already got one here, but I'll just create a new one. New translation. Beep. and then I'll click. Well, let's see, why is it not opening our account? Let's select the file first. I did. Okay, now we'll go back. There we go. All right, so this is the comma-separated value file. Now you see here at the bottom, well, actually at the top first, I'll note one thing. So it's not in comma-separated value file form yet. Notice it opens it as an XLS file. This opens it up in Excel form. Now, the reason it does that is just make it easier for you to edit it. But then when you close it and save it, it saves it as a comma-separated value file, which that's what the translator looks for and uses. And what you see here down at the bottom are worksheets. So you have levels, colors, weights, line styles, and fonts. And what you would do is through here, you could say, add the levels, in this case, that are used in the active design file. In other words, the one AutoCAD file I just opened, then when I do this, it would then put those levels that are used in that file here. Then if I need to map those to specific MicroStation levels, I would then type in the data or grab them from a level table in MicroStation and paste them in here. And then as necessary, I would move these around to map one to the other. And then for colors, I would do the same sort of thing. I would have to go grab the colors by index from the AutoCAD file. And then for the V8 output for MicroStation file, you would put the colors you want to map those to here. It also gives you, by the way, I just want to scroll down here a bit. It does give you instructions for the different things that you can care for and do with these particular areas. So it gives you some help along the way. It's not like it just gives you a spreadsheet and you fill in the data and say, you're on your own, have fun. No, it does give you some help in all these different areas. So you go colors, weights. Now weights, notice it has, if you're going from MicroStation to AutoCAD, because this same comma-separated value file would be utilized whether you're going AutoCAD to MicroStation or vice versa. Then if you're going MicroStation to AutoCAD, you could set the weight thickness, but also the color, because those two combinations, color in AutoCAD side of things, are what determines the weight as far as plotting and that sort of thing. That's common. It's been that way in AutoCAD for a long time. Then line styles, you would do the same thing. And then you have additional options for scale, as you see here. Not only the name, but then the scale. Same thing for DWG. And the output line style file. And then same thing for fonts. You can specify fonts. And then in addition, on DWG, you have not only the font itself, but the font type, whether it's SHX or TrueType, and also the width factor and the height factor. So you can set the scale factor when you're mapping from MicroStation fonts to AutoCAD fonts if you're doing translations through this comma-separated value file as well. And then you can also handle cell names, and this is remapped only when you're saving to a MicroStation V7 format. And it's needed because prior to V8, MicroStation had 6-character limit for cell names. So if you're saving out to V7 format, because you have some legacy set of V7 files, then you just have to map the full names, which you can add many character names for cells or blocks, as you would call them in AutoCAD, in MicroStation, to 6-character cell names in V7. So after you fill in this data for doing the mappings, you would save it, and it saves it out as a comma-separated value file. And then that file, any mappings that you set up and that were available in it, these options would then turn on, and you'd be able to check them and say, I want you to use these mappings that I set up in the comma-separated value file to be able to do the translation. Again, going from the AutoCAD file as it's opened right now in MicroStation to MicroStation format. And then you have options here for handling the references, if there were any references attached to that DWG file. You have different options where you can retain them. You could merge them into the file, merge them into a cell block equivalent in AutoCAD, or you can admit it all together. And you have other options here for converting the references or not, as the case may be. And if you want to copy the levels, if they're not found, or if overrides exist, or always. And then you can unnest live nested attachments and other options there. And then filter For geometry, you can say, give me everything. And then you have the ability to also copy over auxiliary coordinate systems, saved views, and these other instances that you see here. In almost every case, these options that you see that are turned on by default, you'll want to use. It would be rare. And you can check in the documentation for the translator itself to see what each one of these options gives you. And if, in looking over your translation, you see that maybe turning off an option would give you a little better output so that it requires little attention or less attention when you go to the output format file to get it into the format that is needed, then fine. But in most cases, any translations you're going to do, these options will be the ones used. That's why they're the defaults. So after you've got these set then, so I would save this out as the DWG file as my MicroStation file. Let's give it a slightly different name here. And then when I fit, the colors and everything that you see are going to be, without any changes that I made, are pretty much going to be the same. Now, one thing that I'll also point out related to this is line styles. Now, MicroStation has its own line styles that when you place a line, for example, I did this up here earlier. Now, this is coming from the DWG file, so this is not going to be exactly what I wanted to show you, but I'm going to go to another file and then come back to this to explain something. So I'll open up the first DGN file, and when I do a fit here, this line. So you see this, let me select the line here. This line, when I zoom in on it, you'll see how the width and spacing of the different pieces of the line stay exactly the same no matter how far I zoom in on it or how far out I zoom in from it. It's still the same. So that's a typical MicroStation line. Now, in AutoCAD, those types of lines, or this type of line in MicroStation, is really what you would call in AutoCAD. I mean, lost my name, my main notes here. It's either a custom line style, is I believe how MicroStation refers to it. I lost track of things here. Let me see. Line. Oh, where'd it go here? Lost my place. Line style. Right. So let's see here. Oops, a little earlier than that. Previous. And maybe I've got it spelled wrong. All right, so, right. So in MicroStation, you have lines that are auto-scaling. This is the type of line that we're talking about. So no matter how zoomed in or out you might be, you'll see the line style the same way. Now in AutoCAD, they have what we call a MicroStation custom line styles. I mixed up the two here. So a custom line style, as you zoom in, the spaces or gaps get bigger. So I'll go back to the one AutoCAD file that I had translated, and these are the types of lines that I'm talking about here. So when I select these, oh, why does it still have my line tool activated? Let's see here. Do fit, Well, these two lines here, there we go, select mode. So that line there and this line here are both what we would call in MicroStation custom line styles. But this is what AutoCAD has. So as I zoom in on these, you'll see how the gaps get bigger and the parts get bigger. So that's one thing that you have to care for related to translating MicroStation files to AutoCAD and vice versa. Now, what you'd have to do is this. If you go to, you'll need, and you'll find this out by looking in AutoCAD's data on translating. In fact, I think I got a screenshot here. Let me go grab this. Translation help. Oh, maybe I don't here. But I'll be able to explain it here. So what you need to do is you need to find the MicroStation file that is the resource file. But this is in particular when you're going from MicroStation to AutoCAD. And if I go to my folder here, there we go, 1, 2, help. I just had it here, screenshot. Save, blah, blah, resource file, there we go. All right, so in MicroStation V8, yeah, is this it? No, I opened one and I lost it here. Let me go back. Okay, let me zoom in. So this is MicroStation V8i. Now, you'll see here it's down in Program Data, C Program Data, Bentley, MicroStation V8i, Workspace, System, Symbology. This is the default line style resource file. Now, when you go into AutoCAD's help related to going from MicroStation to AutoCAD, in order to care for lines to get them in the way that you want, so you can map one line style from MicroStation to an appropriate line style in AutoCAD, you're going to need this file in your search path for resources for AutoCAD. And the documentation on the translator tells you where you need to put it in order to find that. So you need to grab this file and then put it in a path that AutoCAD would search for such things. And in most cases, if you're going to be working with a client that you've got these MicroStation files from, they're going to have this file. Now, it may not be named this exact name, lstyle.rsc. The RSC, by the way, is just a resource file. And you also see you've got a fonts one there, too. You can grab this, or they'll give it to you, and whatever it's named, you then put it in the folder necessary for your AutoCAD translator to be able to find, and then you'll be able to work with the styles more easily going from MicroStation to AutoCAD and be able to map them accordingly. It's just something you might have to care for related to line styles. All right, so now we'll continue on here. And see, so I've covered more than I thought in this little short period of time. I just had some bullet points here that I'm going through here. All right, so now actually I'm going to stop here for the MicroStation side of things, and I'm going to go into AutoCAD a little bit. And it's set up somewhat similarly when it comes to dealing with or handling the translation of MicroStation files to AutoCAD. The first thing I'll show you here is I'm going to open up a MicroStation or an AutoCAD file here first. And the interface has changed since I think it's like 2016 or so. And if I go to the big A and go to Open, notice here I have DGN import. Now, it used to be quite some versions ago, I think 4 or 5, where you could open a DGN file directly in AutoCAD. And they've modified that since then, where you can just do an import. But it's similar, but it just imports in. Notice you see it says here, you can import a DGN file into a new DWG file. So just instead of opening it in native form, you translate it right to a AutoCAD form. So if I click that, I then go out and I'm going to grab a DGN file, click Open. And when I do that, notice it gives me Import DGN Settings. Now, notice it's got Help here. Help will take you directly to the different options and settings here for, in this case, AutoCAD 2020, of things that you may need to care for related to this particular dialog box and doing mappings from the AutoCAD side. So in MicroStation, going from MicroStation to AutoCAD or vice versa using its translator, you can use that comma-separated value file. In AutoCAD, you have a similar setup, but it's not a separate, like, comma-separated value file. You have a standard mapping setup, and if you see under here, Mapping Settings, you click that, and you can create a new one based on the standard one there. So if I click New, and I'll give it a name, I'll say Standard 1, and then leave it as Import. Can't change it anyway. Then it gives you layers, so this is very similar to what you saw in the comma-separated value file for MicroStation. You go to Layers, and then you can click these, and you can edit them for the DWG output on where the levels that you need these input levels from MicroStation to go to AutoCAD. Same thing for line types. You map them here. And then the same thing for line weights, almost exactly what you saw in the MicroStation side of things. And then colors as well. You would in this case, I have no colors set up special in MicroStation or AutoCAD, but notice you could also say add properties from the MicroStation file. So you would grab a MicroStation file and you could add properties from it, which would add them to this particular area. Or you can go to DWG, grab another DWG file, and it will add the properties based on what's in that file to this dialog box as well. And then once you're done, you give it this a description, click OK, and it would save it out, and then it would be another, for the particular project that you're working on, based on the mappings that you set, it would be another mapping that you could use related to mappings that you're going to do from translating MicroStation files to AutoCAD. And you have other settings here as well, as far as for handling the mass units or subunits when you do the import, and whether to translate the references for the MicroStation files or not. You could either ignore them or translate them to blocks or references, or you could attach them as underlays, that sort of thing. So it's a similar setup, but slightly different just to how the interface handles the MicroStation file as opposed to the AutoCAD file. And then you can also go, if I go back and open, let's say, this AutoCAD file, and I'll do a zoom extents, I can go File, Export, and notice I can export it as a DGN file. And if I do so, it's just going to take what you have here, and it's just going to save it out. And then it gives you similar options for doing the mappings on the output side. So it's similar to MicroStation in that you have both DWG Open settings that you can set, and then you have DGN Save settings, and even MicroStation also has a DWG Save or Export settings. And similar, you have the same sort of setup in AutoCAD as well. And the help in both cases, one thing I want to mention about the translators themselves is the help files covering in both MicroStation V8i and also the newer version MicroStation Connect, and also AutoCAD's help for the translators and what they can do and the different types of objects that and limitations where they recommend you use certain ones and not others, is actually pretty good based on my going through them and working with them myself. So if you run into problems or you have questions, I recommend that you do dive into the help file a little bit, and you can pretty quickly and easily with some searches find solutions to problems and get questions answered. And you can also, if those don't answer directly what you need, the different community forums for both Autodesk and for Bentley's are pretty good about having data that you can find that would help you with different things that you might run into related to translation. So that's the bulk of what I needed and wanted to cover here related to translation tips going from one file format to the other, and things that you might have to care for, and things that you might, if you run into problems where you can get help and that sort of thing. Now, related to all this, Axiom, as I mentioned earlier at the beginning of this webinar, we've been helping people with translations for quite a few years now. I think since like the mid 2000s, before 2010 or so. And we, in doing that, the product manager that was doing that, as I mentioned earlier, he was using the MicroStation translator initially to help people that we were doing the consulting for translate their MicroStation or AutoCAD files to the other format using a comma-separated value file, which I pointed out earlier, to be able to do mappings from fonts to fonts, levels, layers, things of that nature. And during that process, one thing I didn't mention at the time is he also developed some tools which helped pre-process the files. It would do some gathering of information, of data in the files like levels, fonts, etc. And then he also developed some post-processing tools. Now, on the post-processing side, it did things like this. Sometimes you would find in doing translations, one set of input files is using a font that has every symbol that's used in those files, and you need to map that to a font on the output side, going from MicroStation to AutoCAD or vice versa, where the output side font has everything else, but it's missing a symbol, like a centerline symbol or something like that. Now, in cases like that, then if you don't have that post-processing tool, then you would have to painstakingly go through and manually find the input text elements that use that symbol, and then find the matching symbols in the find those matching pieces of text in the output side, and make sure that those symbols were then replaced with a centerline symbol that you might borrow from another output side font. Well, the post-processing tool that he developed will allow you to set that up through an interface, so that if you do have a symbol like that that's missing on the output side font, you can very easily select an output side font and use its symbol as a substitute for one that might be missing in the font that you're mapping to, sort of thing. And there's other tools that he developed as well. So after a while of doing translations like that and working with people doing consulting, that product manager said, you know what? He went to the head of our technical division. He said, I could take everything that I just described to you and put it into an interface of one program. And when I do so, it'll handle a couple things which I think would be ideal. One of which is it would allow him to add the pre-processing tools to that particular program. In other words, make those pre-processing tools directly available to people that were doing translations. 2, he would also be able to set up configuring the translations, like I showed you with the DWG Open options in MicroStation, and also the DWG or DGN Save options in MicroStation, where he could set up that configuration through the interface of the program to where it would give you some help for each one of the settings and give you data on things that you may need to care for related to those settings. And then in addition, he said he could also then add the post-processing tools to that same interface so that people would have access to those as well. And in tying it all into one interface, then everything would be in one place that you'd be able to do your translations from, instead of working through other interface items and possibly external files and things like that. Now, on top of that, one of the main reasons he also wanted to do it is it would save people money in relationship to, instead of paying us fees for consulting fees to help them do translations from MicroStation to AutoCAD and vice versa, then we could get them a program in their hands that would tie everything I just told you together in one interface and save them money. They wouldn't have to pay us consulting fees to be able to do their translations with the same tools that we were using too. Plus, he also added the ability to use AutoCAD's translator as well. So the program that I'm discussing is called TranslationManager. I'm just going to show you a quick thing in the interface since we're almost out of time here for the webinar. But it's something that I commonly cover when I do this webinar and cover the tips that the programs AutoCAD and MicroStation have natively. This is just an extra thing that I'll show you as well. So this is Translation Manager, and this is what I just described to you. So you see here, you take the translation mode, MicroStation or AutoCAD, and then you tell it what file format you want to export to. You can export to DXF, DWG, MicroStation V7 or MicroStation V8. And then translators to use, this would be based on what you have installed in your system. So the program itself doesn't translate anything, just like the product manager was doing initially. He used MicroStation's own command line different translator. Similar, the program does the same thing. It just looks for what translators are available that it's compatible with. And then you select them. Now, one thing I'm going to show you about the translators, which many people don't know, is this, is that the MicroStation translators have more capabilities for configuring the translation than AutoCAD translators do generally. And I'll show you what I mean. So if I use the MicroStation V8i Select Series 10 translator, which is on my system, going from MicroStation to AutoCAD, if I click Configure, you'll see from basic down to remap symbology, it has 11 categories which you can use to configure the translation. It gives you a ton of control and a bunch of different settings, which the more control you have over this area, the better the formatting is going to be of your output files, meaning the less work it's going to take to get your output files into the exact format they need to be in order for your client to accept them. Now, that was MicroStation to AutoCAD using the MicroStation translator. If I go the opposite direction, AutoCAD to MicroStation, and click Configure, notice it only gives you 5 categories, from basic to remap. Now, the AutoCAD translators, no matter which one you use, if I click Configure, it only gives you 3 categories, basic, references, and remap. And the same thing if you go the opposite translation, MicroStation to AutoCAD. Click Configure. Notice only 3. So in every case, the MicroStation translators, in one case it gives you 11, other case it gives you 5 categories for configuring the translation. It gives you more capabilities in terms of configuring the translation to make it more likely that your files, when they're finally translated, will be as close to the format that you want them to be in when the translation is finally done. Now, in addition to that, you choose what files you want to process, and then you give it a destination folder for your output translated files. You can also tell it to put each of the translated files into the same folder as the original file. You would do this if your output is going to be the opposite file format. In other words, it might have the same base name but different extension. So you could use this option there. But in most cases, people will put their output translated files into a separate folder. Just makes it easier to deal with the separate set of files, that sort of thing. And then you see here down below what I was telling you about earlier when I was describing this. Here's the pre-processing tools through this button, and then configuration like I showed you earlier, and then translate is step 2. Step 3 is post-process. And then I'll go into pre-process and explain this a little bit. Now, by the way, this is a batch processing program. Just like any batch processing program where you're going to be dealing with multiple files at a time, you want to make sure that you have a good backup of the files before you batch process them with this or any other batch processing program. However, you'll notice here right at the end of pre-process, and this is the case for pre-processing and also post-processing, you have backup here. By default, it will automatically create backups of any files that you pre-process. The reason being is because you may be making changes to those files before you translate them, so it saves a copy of the original format. So if you need to go back to the original form of the file before any modifications were made with pre-processing, you could do so. Now, evaluate. What this does is this looks in the files that you're processing here or going to be translating, and it makes copies of the data that you see here listed for the different categories into text-based DAT files. Now, if I go to disk here, I'm going to open this up here on the side, and I'm going to drill down here a little bit. I'm going to show you, I set this all up before just to save time when I show people this, is I already did an evaluation of the input files, and you'll see here, right here, M to A. If I go back to the interface, you'll see here in the title bar, this M to A.pjt, this is a project file. It's the settings file for TranslationManager. And what happens is when you run this pre-processing step, the evaluation, what it does is it looks in the files and then it makes copies of the data out to separate text-based .dat files using the name of the project file and then an underscore and then the name of the category. So here you see is the project file name underscore levels .dat. If I open that, it's just a text file, and these are all the levels that are used in that particular set of files. This will come into play when you do the mappings in the comma-separated value file, like I showed you much earlier in the webinar. And we actually took a copy or added macros to that particular comma-separated value file that we use through TranslationManager, to where you can just press a button and it will input this file and all the levels right into the spreadsheet for the input side. You can then use this evaluation step by kind of fooling the program, by the way, to save you time on the output side too. And the way you would do that is you would just close this. You would actually set up another project file by going Project New. And I've already done this earlier, so I'll just go Open to do the opposite translation. Basically, all you're doing by doing this is you're fooling the program, saying, I'm not doing a translation this way, I'm doing it the other way. And the only reason you would do this is to save you time. You can then grab files that are representative of your output files. It could be, if you're going to MicroStation, it could be a seed file. It could be a DGN library file. It could even be any design file that has the levels, fonts, and other things in it that you need your output files to have. Or if it's AutoCAD, it could be a template file or any AutoCAD file that has the levels, fonts, or layers, fonts, etc. that you need. And then you click Pre-Process, and then you pre-process those files that are representative of the output files, and it will create, based on the name you gave this project file, separate set of DAT files for your output files. Again, here you see AutoCAD to MicroStation levels.dat. Again, this will just save you time because you can open this and then copy and paste the levels into the levels worksheet of the comma-separated value file, again to save you time when it goes to setting up mappings in the remapping symbology comma-separated value file. Now once you do that, you will go back to the original project file that I had, which is MicroStation AutoCAD. And the reason we set this up, by the way, as a project file is because you can set up through the settings here what you think is going to get you the best output, and then do a couple of test translations of a subset of the files that you're going to be translating. Check your output. If the output files are not quite what you want in the settings, you can go back into the project, tweak the settings, save them, do another test translation, and little by little you can dial in the settings so that your output files will be as close to the format that you need so that they require little or no further attention to get them into the format you need for delivering to your client, for example. So that's the design philosophy around the interface for the program too. Is it's set up so you can dial in the settings, and once you have them set, is you just can load that project file and use it over and over for that particular project to translate the files out based on the settings that are there. You can then also, if you get similar jobs that maybe have different settings, you can save out your project file, tweak the settings for the new project, using one that you have as a base, and then do your test translations and dial in the settings there. So it's very flexible in that regard. And you can also do drops or explodes here on pre-processing. There's no hard and fast rule for doing drops or explodes. It really boils down to you would only use these if you think it's going to get you better output. Do a test translation, see if it does give you a better output, and if it does, then keep the setting. And if not, go back and tweak it, turn it off, save your settings, and then do another test translation, again, continuing to dial in the settings until you get the format of the output files as close to what you want. You can also do some modifications here and compresses and purges of your input files, and again, backups. Configure I covered, and I'm going to go ahead and do a translate so I can show you the dialog box here, and this just gives you data on successful translations, failed translations, files that are already translated, and unsupported file types. And based on the numbers you see here and going to the log, you'll have to go trace down the files that had the problem and then fix that. And then lastly, post-processing, just like pre-processing, but this takes the output files and allows you to do things like replace special text characters. This is where you would do the things where you're missing a symbol on an output side font where you could borrow another output side font to replace that symbol. And you can also do compresses and purges, automatically creates backups, and drops or explodes. So that's a real general quick overview of Translation Manager in relationship to the context of what we covered here in Translation Tips. And with that then, I'm going to end off on the webinar. Thank you guys very much for attending. I really appreciate it. And with that, I'll let you guys go, and we'll make the videos available, like I said. And thanks very much for your time. I hope this had some useful information for you, and we'll talk to you later.